General freezes after spotting hospital nurse's tattoo. Her scar was from his lost squadron. What happened next would change everything. Both of them thought they knew about courage, sacrifice, and the invisible wounds that bind warriors together. Across time and circumstance. Nurse Elena Vasquez had been working the night shift at St. Mary's Veterans Medical Center for 3 years, when she first developed her reputation for being the one who could reach the unreachable patients. The sprawling hospital complex in Denver served thousands of veterans from conflicts spanning 5 decades, and its sterile corridors echoed with stories of heroism and heartbreak that most civilians would never fully understand. Elena moved through these halls with a quiet competence that made her invaluable to both patients and staff, her presence bringing calm to chaos and hope to despair. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. At 28, Elena possessed the kind of steady professionalism that came from understanding trauma from both sides. She had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic before transitioning to civilian healthcare, and that experience had taught her to read the subtle signs that other nurses might miss. The way a patient's breathing changed when helicopters flew overhead, the tension that crept into their shoulders when doors slammed too loudly, the distant look that meant someone was fighting battles that had ended years ago but continued to rage in their minds. Her colleagues often marveled at Elena's ability to connect with the most difficult patients. Veterans who had been labeled as non-compliant or hostile would become cooperative and even grateful under her care. She never raised her voice, never showed impatience, and never treated their invisible wounds as less real than their visible ones. When Private Johnson refused to let anyone change his bandages because he was convinced the staff were enemy combatants, Elena sat with him for 2 hours, speaking softly about their shared experiences until he recognized her as a fellow soldier and allowed her to help. The surgical scar that ran from Elena's left shoulder blade to her ribs was hidden beneath her scrubs, but it served as a constant reminder of why she had chosen this path. She had earned that scar during a Taliban ambush outside Kandahar, when an improvised explosive device had torn through her medical unit's convoy. The blast had killed 3 of her teammates and left her with shrapnel wounds that required months of rehabilitation. But the physical scars had healed more easily than the emotional ones, and Elena had discovered that helping other veterans navigate their recovery gave meaning to her own survival. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the head of the psychiatric unit, had watched Elena work with challenging patients and recognized something special in her approach. Elena didn't just treat symptoms. She understood the warrior mindset and could speak the language of military service in ways that helped bridge the gap between clinical care and human connection. When a former Marine sergeant had barricaded himself in his room and refused all treatment, Elena had simply sat outside his door and told him about the firefight where she had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. The night shift suited Elena's temperament and her mission. While the hospital grew quiet and most staff focused on routine monitoring, she found opportunities to spend extra time with patients who couldn't sleep, who needed someone to listen to their stories, who required the kind of presence that couldn't be scheduled or quantified. She had learned during her military service that the most important battles often happened in the quiet moments between crises, when fear and loneliness could be more devastating than any enemy fire. Elena's approach to nursing went beyond medical protocols and treatment plans. She understood that healing required more than medication and procedures. It demanded recognition of the whole person behind the patient identification number. When she encountered a veteran struggling with addiction, she didn't see a problem to be managed but a warrior who had found unhealthy ways to cope with experiences that defied civilian understanding. When she worked with patients suffering from traumatic brain injuries, she recognized that their frustration and confusion came from minds that had once been sharp and decisive, now struggling with tasks that had once been automatic. The tattoo on Elena's right forearm was partially visible when she rolled up her sleeves, though most people only noticed the intricate design without understanding its significance. The image depicted a phoenix rising from flames, surrounded by military dog tags and the dates of her deployments. But the detail that held the most meaning was barely noticeable unless someone looked closely. The small squadron insignia integrated into the phoenix's wing, representing the unit she had served with in Afghanistan and the brothers and sisters she had lost during that final mission. Elena's reputation extended beyond her own unit to other departments throughout the hospital. Doctors who had initially been skeptical of her unconventional methods began requesting her specifically for their most challenging cases. She had a way of getting patients to comply with treatment plans that others couldn't implement, not through coercion or manipulation, but through genuine understanding and respect for their experiences. When a former Army Ranger refused to participate in physical therapy because he was convinced his injuries made him worthless, Elena shared her own story of recovery and showed him that healing wasn't about returning to who you were before, but about becoming who you were meant to be after. The medical center's administrators had taken notice of Elena's exceptional patient satisfaction scores and her ability to reduce incidents of non-compliance and early discharge requests. Shift supervisor Margaret Chun had been nursing for 20 years and had never seen anyone connect with traumatized veterans the way Elena did. Margaret often found herself assigning Elena to the most difficult cases, knowing that her unique combination of medical expertise and military experience made her uniquely qualified to help patients who had been written off by others. Elena's personal life was deliberately simple and focused. She lived in a small apartment near the hospital, spending her off-duty hours volunteering at a local veterans organization that helped former service members transition to civilian employment. She understood that her own healing was connected to her ability to help others find their paths forward, and she had built her entire life around that mission. The relationships she had lost during her military service and the friendships that had been complicated by her transition to civilian life had taught her that purpose could be found in service to others, even when personal happiness seemed elusive. Challenges Elena faced in her work were not just clinical but emotional. Every day brought reminders of her own trauma, her own losses, and her own ongoing struggle to find meaning in survival when so many others had not been as fortunate. She had learned to channel that pain into compassion, to transform her own wounds into sources of strength for others. But the process was never easy, and there were nights when she drove home from the hospital, carrying the weight of stories that would stay with her long after her shift ended. Elena's colleagues respected her dedication, but few understood the full depth of her commitment to the veterans under her care. She wasn't just doing the job. She was honoring the memory of those she had lost and fulfilling a promise she had made to herself during her own darkest moments of recovery. Every patient she helped represented a victory against the forces that had taken so much from her and her fellow service members. Every success story was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of understanding to bridge even the deepest chasms of trauma and loss. The night shift at St. Mary's Veterans Medical Center was about to become the setting for an encounter that would test everything Elena had learned about courage, sacrifice, and the invisible bonds that connect those who have served. She had no way of knowing that her quiet competence and dedication were about to intersect with forces beyond her control, or that the very qualities that made her exceptional would soon make her a target for those who saw her success as a threat to their own authority and position. The first sign of trouble came when Dr. Marcus Caldwell was appointed as the new Chief of Staff at St. Mary's Veterans Medical Center. Caldwell arrived with impressive credentials from prestigious East Coast hospitals and a mandate from the hospital board to modernize operations and improve efficiency metrics. His background was impeccable on paper: Harvard Medical School, residency at Johns Hopkins, administrative experience at 3 major medical centers, and a reputation for turning around underperforming departments. What wasn't immediately apparent was his fundamental misunderstanding of the unique challenges facing veteran patients and the specialized care they required. Dr. Caldwell's first staff meeting revealed his priorities with uncomfortable clarity. He stood at the front of the main conference room, his tailored suit and polished demeanor creating an immediate contrast with the more relaxed atmosphere that had characterized the hospital's previous leadership. His presentation focused heavily on standardized protocols, measurable outcomes, and the need to eliminate what he called inefficient practices that couldn't be justified through traditional healthcare metrics. The phrase that would later haunt many staff members was his declaration that emotional support and extended patient interactions were luxuries the hospital could no longer afford in an era of accountability and cost containment. Elena sat in the back of the room, listening to Caldwell's vision with growing unease. His approach seemed to view patients as data points rather than human beings, and his emphasis on rapid turnover and streamlined processes ignored the complex trauma that required time, patience, and individualized care to address effectively. When he announced that nursing staff would be expected to increase their patient loads by 30% while reducing average interaction time per patient, Elena realized that everything she had built at St. Mary's was about to be systematically dismantled. The new protocols that Caldwell implemented within his first month revealed the depth of his misunderstanding about veteran care. Nurses were required to document every interaction in excessive detail, focusing on quantifiable activities rather than the quality of care provided. The time Elena had previously spent sitting with patients who couldn't sleep, listening to their stories, or providing the kind of presence that helped them feel safe and understood, was now classified as unproductive time that needed to be eliminated. Patient satisfaction scores, which had been consistently high under Elena's care, were deemed less important than bed turnover rates and medication compliance statistics. Elena's first direct confrontation with Caldwell occurred during a routine department meeting where he was reviewing individual performance metrics. He singled out Elena's patient load statistics, noting that she consistently spent more time with each patient than hospital guidelines recommended. His tone carried the unmistakable implication that her approach was problematic rather than beneficial, and he suggested that her excessive emotional involvement with patients was preventing her from achieving optimal efficiency levels. Elena maintained her professional composure while explaining that veteran patients often required additional time to build trust and feel safe receiving care. But Caldwell dismissed her concerns as excuses for poor time management. The systematic pressure began subtly but persistently. Elena found herself receiving additional documentation requirements that other nurses didn't face, ostensibly to help her optimize her patient interaction protocols. Her shift supervisor, Margaret Chun, was instructed to conduct more frequent performance reviews and to focus specifically on Elena's time management and adherence to standardized procedures. The message was clear. Elena's successful but unconventional approach to patient care was now viewed as a liability that needed to be corrected or eliminated. Caldwell's background as a civilian physician who had never served in the military or worked extensively with veteran populations became increasingly apparent as he implemented changes that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of military culture and trauma. He dismissed the importance of military experience among staff members, arguing that medical expertise was universal and that specialized knowledge about veteran issues was unnecessary in a modern healthcare environment. This perspective put him in direct conflict with Elena, whose military background and combat experience were integral to her effectiveness with veteran patients. The breaking point came when Caldwell announced the implementation of new patient management software that would track every minute of nursing staff time and flag any interactions that exceeded predetermined duration limits. Elena realized that this system would make it impossible to provide the kind of care that veteran patients needed, essentially forcing her to abandon the approaches that had made her most effective. When she raised concerns about how these changes would impact patient outcomes, Caldwell responded with barely concealed irritation and suggested that her resistance to modernization indicated an unwillingness to adapt to professional standards. Elena's colleagues began to notice the increased scrutiny she was receiving and the way Caldwell seemed to single her out for criticism during staff meetings. Dr. Hendricks, who had always supported Elena's work with psychiatric patients, found herself receiving pressure to reassign Elena to less complex cases, where her tendency toward over-involvement would be less problematic. The systematic nature of the campaign became clear when other nurses reported being questioned about Elena's methods and asked to provide examples of times when her approach had been inappropriate or ineffective. The veteran patients themselves began to notice the changes in Elena's demeanor and availability. Men and women who had relied on her presence and understanding found that her visits were shorter and more rushed, constrained by the new protocols that measured her worth in minutes rather than outcomes. Former Marine Staff Sergeant David Rodriguez, who had been making significant progress in his recovery from severe depression, asked Elena directly why she seemed different, why she couldn't spend time talking with him the way she used to. Elena's explanation about new hospital policies only confirmed what many patients suspected. The institution was changing in ways that would make their healing more difficult. Dr. Caldwell's campaign against Elena intensified when he began receiving reports from other departments about her insubordination and failure to follow established protocols. These reports, which Elena later learned had been solicited rather than volunteered, painted a picture of a nurse who was difficult to work with and resistant to authority. The irony was not lost on Elena that her greatest strength, her ability to connect with patients who had been failed by traditional approaches, was being reframed as her greatest weakness. The pressure escalated when Caldwell instituted mandatory efficiency coaching sessions for Elena, ostensibly to help her improve her performance metrics. These sessions, conducted weekly in his office, felt more like interrogations than professional development opportunities. Caldwell would review Elena's patient interaction logs in excruciating detail, questioning every decision that deviated from standard protocols and suggesting that her military background had created inappropriate boundaries between her and her patients. His tone implied that her empathy was a professional liability and that her understanding of veteran issues was an obstacle to providing proper medical care. Elena's reputation among patients and staff created a problem for Caldwell that he hadn't anticipated. Her patient satisfaction scores remained the highest in the hospital despite the increased constraints on her time, and other nurses began expressing frustration with the new protocols that prevented them from providing the kind of care they knew their patients needed. The contrast between Elena's results and Caldwell's metrics-driven approach became increasingly difficult to ignore, creating tension that threatened to expose the flaws in his administrative philosophy. The systematic nature of Caldwell's campaign became clear when Elena discovered that he had been documenting every interaction they had, building a file that portrayed her as insubordinate, resistant to change, and potentially dangerous to patient welfare. The man who had never served in combat, never held a dying soldier in his arms, never experienced the particular kind of trauma that defined the veteran experience, was positioning himself as the authority on how best to care for those who had sacrificed everything for their country. His assault on Elena's methods was not just an attack on her professional competence, but a rejection of the very idea that military experience and understanding had value in a medical setting. Elena found herself caught in an impossible situation. She could conform to Caldwell's protocols and abandon the approaches that had made her most effective, essentially betraying the patients who depended on her understanding and support. Or she could maintain her principles and face the inevitable consequences of defying an administrator who had made clear his intention to eliminate what he saw as outdated and inefficient practices. The choice would define not just her career, but her integrity as both a healthcare professional and a veteran who had promised to never abandon her fellow service members. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Elena believed about duty, sacrifice, and the obligation to protect those who had already given so much in service to their country. Dr. Caldwell's systematic campaign had created a crisis that would force everyone at St. Mary's Veterans Medical Center to choose between efficiency and compassion, between administrative convenience and the complex realities of caring for America's wounded warriors. The escalation of Dr. Caldwell's campaign against Elena began with what appeared to be routine policy changes, but quickly revealed itself as a systematic effort to undermine her effectiveness and credibility. Within weeks of implementing the new patient management software, Caldwell introduced additional requirements that seemed specifically designed to target Elena's approach to veteran care. New documentation protocols required nurses to justify any patient interaction lasting longer than 15 minutes, with detailed explanations for why standard procedures were insufficient. Elena found herself spending hours after each shift completing paperwork that other nurses weren't required to file, documenting conversations and interventions that had previously been considered routine aspects of quality care. The administrative burden was crushing, but it was only the beginning. Caldwell instituted surprise inspections of Elena's patient interactions, sending supervisors to observe her work and document any deviations from newly established protocols. These observations were presented as quality improvement measures, but their frequency and focus made it clear that Elena was being singled out for scrutiny that bordered on harassment. When she provided comfort to a former Army Ranger experiencing flashbacks, the inspector noted that she had exceeded the allocated time for emotional support interventions. When she helped a Navy veteran understand his medication regimen by relating it to his military experience, this was documented as inappropriate personal disclosure. Elena's patient assignments began to change in ways that seemed designed to set her up for failure. She was given the most challenging cases, veterans with severe psychiatric conditions, multiple trauma histories, and histories of non-compliance with treatment, while being held to the same efficiency standards as nurses working with less complex patients. When Army Specialist Maria Santos arrived with severe PTSD and a history of violent outbursts, Elena was assigned to her care despite having a full patient load. When Santos had a breakdown during Elena's shift, requiring extensive crisis intervention, Elena was criticized for allowing the situation to escalate rather than being praised for preventing a potentially dangerous incident. The Whisper campaign against Elena intensified as Caldwell began meeting privately with other staff members, planting seeds of doubt about her methods and professionalism. He suggested that Elena's military background made her too emotionally involved with patients, that her approach was enabling rather than therapeutic, and that her resistance to new protocols indicated a lack of adaptability that was concerning in a healthcare environment. These conversations were presented as confidential discussions about staff development, but their effect was to create an atmosphere of suspicion and doubt around Elena's competence and professional judgment. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychiatrist who had worked closely with Elena on several difficult cases, found herself called into Caldwell's office for what he described as a consultation about patient care standards. During the meeting, Caldwell questioned Elena's involvement in Walsh's treatment plans, suggesting that Elena was overstepping her role as a nurse and inappropriately influencing medical decisions. He asked Walsh to document any instances where Elena had made suggestions about patient care that went beyond her scope of practice, framing these requests as necessary for maintaining proper professional boundaries. The systematic nature of Caldwell's campaign became clear when Elena discovered that he had been conducting similar meetings with other physicians, social workers, and administrative staff. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Caldwell would express concern about Elena's methods, suggest that her approach was potentially harmful to patients, and request documentation of any problems or incidents that could be used to build a case against her. The cumulative effect was to create a paper trail of complaints and concerns that painted Elena as a problematic employee who posed risks to patient safety and hospital operations. Elena's most vulnerable moment came when she was assigned to care for retired Colonel James Mitchell, a Vietnam veteran with severe depression and suicidal ideation. Mitchell had been hospitalized after a suicide attempt and was refusing to speak with any staff members, creating a crisis that required immediate intervention. Elena spent an entire shift sitting with Mitchell, sharing her own experiences with survivor's guilt and the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. Her patient, persistent approach eventually broke through Mitchell's defenses, and he began to open up about his struggles and his willingness to accept help. The intervention saved Mitchell's life, but Caldwell used it as evidence of Elena's inappropriate boundary violations and failure to follow established suicide prevention protocols. He documented that Elena had spent excessive time with a single patient, had shared personal information that violated professional standards, and had failed to implement the hospital's standardized suicide prevention procedures. The fact that Elena's approach had been successful in preventing a suicide was dismissed as irrelevant to the policy violations she had committed. The attacks on Elena's competence extended beyond her patient care to include her relationships with colleagues and her overall fitness for nursing practice. Caldwell began questioning her emotional stability, suggesting that her military experiences had created psychological issues that interfered with her ability to provide objective patient care. He raised concerns about her over-identification with veteran patients and implied that her own trauma history made her unsuitable for working with traumatized populations. These attacks struck at the core of Elena's identity and her motivation for choosing nursing as a career. The pressure intensified when Caldwell implemented a new peer review system that required nurses to evaluate each other's performance using standardized criteria that emphasized efficiency and protocol compliance over patient outcomes. Elena found herself receiving negative evaluations from colleagues who had been instructed to focus on her time management and documentation rather than her patient satisfaction scores or clinical results. The system was designed to create an appearance of objective assessment while actually reinforcing Caldwell's predetermined conclusions about Elena's performance deficiencies. Elena's breaking point came when she was called to testify at a patient safety committee meeting about an incident involving a former Marine who had become agitated during a routine procedure. Elena had successfully de-escalated the situation by recognizing the patient's triggers and adapting her approach to accommodate his PTSD symptoms. However, Caldwell presented the incident as evidence of Elena's failure to follow proper restraint protocols and her tendency to coddle patients rather than maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. The committee, composed primarily of administrators with no military experience, accepted Caldwell's interpretation without question. The systematic destruction of Elena's reputation reached its peak when Caldwell announced the implementation of a new patient advocacy program that would remove nurses from direct patient care decisions and limit their interactions to purely technical tasks. Elena realized that this change would eliminate everything that made her effective as a nurse, reducing her to a medication dispenser and vital signs monitor. When she objected to the program during a staff meeting, Caldwell used her opposition as evidence of her unwillingness to adapt to professional standards and her resistance to evidence-based practice. Elena's colleagues began to distance themselves from her as the pressure mounted and the consequences of association with a problem employee became clear. Nurses who had once sought her advice about difficult patients now avoided her in the hallways. physicians who had previously requested her for their most challenging cases began asking for different assignments. The isolation was systematic and deliberate, designed to strip away Elena's support systems and make her more vulnerable to the final assault on her career. The bureaucratic maze that Caldwell had constructed around Elena's every action became increasingly complex and punitive. She was required to pre-approve any patient interaction lasting longer than 10 minutes, to document every conversation in excruciating detail, and to justify every decision that deviated from standard protocols. The administrative burden became so overwhelming that Elena found herself working unpaid overtime just to complete the documentation requirements that had been imposed specifically on her. When she filed a complaint about the excessive workload, Caldwell used her inability to manage the requirements as evidence of her professional incompetence. The final phase of Caldwell's campaign involved a systematic review of Elena's entire employment history, looking for any incident or complaint that could be used to support a case for termination. Patient complaints from 3 years earlier were re-examined and reinterpreted as evidence of long-standing problems with Elena's approach to care. Positive feedback from patients and families was dismissed as irrelevant to the serious concerns about her professional conduct. The investigation was presented as a thorough and objective review of Elena's performance, but its predetermined conclusion was obvious to anyone who understood the political dynamics at play. Elena realized that she was trapped in a system designed to eliminate her regardless of her actual performance or the needs of the patients she served. Caldwell's campaign had created a narrative of incompetence and insubordination that would justify any disciplinary action he chose to take. The man who had never served his country, never risked his life for others, never experienced the trauma that defined the veteran experience, was positioning himself as the authority on how best to care for America's wounded warriors. His assault on Elena's methods was not just an attack on her professional competence, but a rejection of the very idea that military experience and understanding had value in a medical setting. The formal investigation into Elena's conduct began on a cold Tuesday morning in March, when she was summoned to Human Resources for what Dr. Caldwell described as a routine performance review. Elena knew immediately that this was no ordinary meeting when she arrived to find not only Caldwell, but also Patricia Morrison, the hospital's chief human resources officer, and Dr. Richard Sterling, the medical director. The conference room felt sterile and hostile, with legal pads and thick folders arranged around the table like weapons prepared for battle. Morrison opened the meeting with clinical precision, reading from a prepared statement that outlined serious concerns about Elena's patient care practices, documentation procedures, and adherence to hospital protocols. The language was carefully chosen to sound objective and professional, but Elena recognized the systematic destruction of her reputation. That had been months in the making. Every interaction she had questioned, every moment of extended patient care she had provided, every instance where she had prioritized healing over efficiency had been documented and twisted into evidence of professional misconduct. The charges against Elena were comprehensive and devastating. She was accused of consistently violating patient interaction protocols by spending excessive time with individual patients, thereby compromising the care of other veterans who needed attention. Her documentation was characterized as incomplete and subjective, focusing too heavily on emotional support and not enough on measurable medical interventions. Most damaging of all, she was accused of overstepping her professional boundaries by sharing personal military experiences with patients, creating inappropriate relationships that violated established therapeutic guidelines. Dr. Sterling, who had previously supported Elena's work with psychiatric patients, now presented her compassionate care as evidence of professional instability. He read from reports that described her over-identification with veteran patients and suggested that her own trauma history had compromised her ability to maintain appropriate clinical objectivity. The fact that Elena's patient satisfaction scores were consistently the highest in the hospital was dismissed as irrelevant to the serious concerns about her professional conduct and adherence to evidence-based practice standards. Elena listened in stunned silence as 3 years of dedicated service were systematically reframed as a pattern of misconduct and incompetence. The former Marine she had talked through a suicidal crisis was now characterized as a patient she had manipulated through inappropriate self-disclosure. The Army veteran whose trust she had earned through patient understanding was described as a victim of her boundary violations. Every success story had been twisted into evidence of her failure to maintain professional standards. Investigation that followed was predetermined in its conclusions, but thorough in its destruction of Elena's reputation. Caldwell had spent months building a case that appeared objective and comprehensive, while actually representing a systematic campaign to eliminate a nurse whose success had threatened his authority. Patient files were reviewed selectively, with positive outcomes ignored and any complications or challenges highlighted as evidence of Elena's inadequate care. Colleagues were interviewed using leading questions that encouraged them to focus on Elena's deviations from protocol rather than her exceptional results. Elena's request to present evidence in her defense was granted in theory but undermined in practice. When she attempted to provide documentation of her patient outcomes, success stories, and testimonials from grateful veterans and their families, these were dismissed as irrelevant to the specific policy violations she had committed. The committee made it clear that they were not interested in whether Elena's methods were effective, only in whether they conformed to established protocols and administrative requirements. The hearing itself was a carefully orchestrated performance, designed to create an appearance of due process while reaching a predetermined conclusion. Elena sat at one end of a long conference table, facing a panel of administrators and physicians who had already decided her fate. Caldwell presented his case with the confidence of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment, using charts and graphs to demonstrate Elena's deviations from standard procedures and her failure to meet efficiency targets. The most devastating moment came when Dr. Walsh, the psychiatrist who had worked closely with Elena on several difficult cases, was called to testify about Elena's professional conduct. Under pressure from Caldwell and facing her own career concerns, Walsh reluctantly confirmed that Elena had sometimes made suggestions about patient care that went beyond her scope of practice as a nurse. The fact that these suggestions had often been valuable and had improved patient outcomes was not mentioned in her testimony. Elena's attempts to explain the context of her actions and the unique needs of veteran patients were repeatedly cut short by committee members who insisted on focusing on policy violations rather than patient outcomes. When she tried to describe how her military experience had helped her connect with traumatized veterans, she was told that personal anecdotes were not relevant to the investigation. When she presented evidence of her exceptional patient satisfaction scores, she was informed that subjective measures were less important than objective compliance with established protocols. The systematic nature of the investigation became clear when Elena realized that none of the committee members had military experience or specialized training in veteran care. They were evaluating her work based on standards developed for general medical populations, with no understanding of the unique challenges and requirements of treating combat trauma. The very expertise that made Elena effective with veteran patients was being used as evidence against her, as if her understanding of military culture was a liability rather than an asset. The final blow came when Elena discovered that patients had been interviewed about her care without her knowledge or consent. Veterans who had trusted her with their most vulnerable moments found themselves being questioned about whether her approach had been appropriate or professional. The men and women who had made significant progress under Elena's care were asked to focus on any concerns they might have had about her methods rather than the healing they had experienced. Former Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had credited Elena with saving his life during his darkest period of depression, was asked leading questions about whether Elena had ever shared too much personal information or spent too much time with him. The fact that this time and personal connection had been crucial to his recovery was not explored. Instead, the investigation focused on whether Elena's approach violated established boundaries and protocols. The committee's questions revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of veteran care and the therapeutic relationship. They could not comprehend that successful treatment of combat trauma often required approaches that deviated from standard medical protocols. They viewed Elena's ability to connect with patients through shared military experience as unprofessional rather than therapeutic. They saw her willingness to spend extra time with struggling veterans as inefficient rather than essential. Elena's defense was hampered by the fact that her most effective interventions were precisely those that violated standard protocols. She could not defend her methods without acknowledging that she had indeed deviated from established procedures. The committee used her honesty against her, treating her admissions that she had prioritized patient needs over administrative requirements as evidence of her unfitness for nursing practice. The investigation's predetermined conclusion became obvious when Elena realized that no amount of evidence would change the committee's decision. Patient testimonials were dismissed as irrelevant. Colleague support was characterized as misguided loyalty. Her exceptional clinical results were ignored in favor of documentation of policy violations. The system was designed to protect administrators like Caldwell while sacrificing nurses like Elena who had devoted their careers to patient care. The charges against Elena expanded during the investigation to include insubordination, failure to follow direct orders, and creating a hostile work environment by questioning administrative decisions. Her advocacy for veteran patients was reframed as resistance to authority. Her suggestions for improving patient care were characterized as inappropriate criticism of hospital policies. Her dedication to healing was presented as evidence of poor judgment and professional instability. Elena's last hope was the support of her patients, but even this was systematically undermined. Veterans who attempted to advocate for Elena were told that their input was not relevant to the investigation. Letters of support from grateful patients and their families were dismissed as emotional rather than professional assessments. The very people Elena had devoted her career to helping were silenced in the process, designed to evaluate her fitness to continue helping them. The investigation concluded with a recommendation for Elena's immediate termination, based on what the committee characterized as a pattern of professional misconduct and inability to adapt to established standards of practice. The decision was presented as objective and necessary for patient safety, but Elena understood that she had been sacrificed to protect an administrator whose metrics-driven approach had failed to understand the complex needs of veteran patients. As Elena left the hearing room, she carried with her the weight of injustice and the knowledge that her career had been destroyed, not because she had failed her patients, but because she had succeeded too well in ways that threatened those who preferred compliance over compassion. The system that was supposed to protect both patients and caregivers had instead chosen to eliminate those who challenged its priorities and methods. The termination meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, deliberately timed to minimize disruption to hospital operations and reduce the likelihood of staff witnesses. Elena arrived at the administrative offices wearing her dress uniform, every ribbon and medal precisely positioned, her bearing military straight despite the crushing weight of injustice on her shoulders. She had chosen to face this final humiliation with the same dignity that had defined her entire career, refusing to allow Dr. Caldwell's systematic campaign to diminish her sense of honor and professional pride. Patricia Morrison delivered the termination notice with bureaucratic efficiency, reading from a prepared statement that outlined Elena's pattern of professional misconduct and inability to adapt to established healthcare standards. The language was carefully crafted to sound objective and necessary, but Elena recognized the systematic destruction of her reputation, that had been months in the making. Every act of compassion had been reframed as a boundary violation. Every moment of extended patient care had been characterized as inefficiency. Every success story had been twisted into evidence of unprofessional conduct. The official charges were comprehensive and devastating. Elena was accused of consistently violating patient interaction protocols, failing to maintain appropriate professional boundaries, and refusing to comply with established documentation requirements. Her military experience, which had been her greatest asset in helping traumatized veterans, was now presented as evidence of her inability to function in a civilian healthcare environment. The very qualities that had made her exceptional were being used to justify her dismissal. Dr. Caldwell sat at the conference table with barely concealed satisfaction, watching as his carefully orchestrated campaign reached its intended conclusion. He had spent months building a case that appeared thorough and objective, while actually representing a systematic effort to eliminate a nurse whose success had threatened his authority. Now he observed Elena's termination with the confidence of someone who had successfully removed an obstacle to his vision of efficient, protocol-driven healthcare. Elena's request to address the committee was granted reluctantly, but her words were received with the polite indifference of people who had already made their decision. She spoke about her 3 years of dedicated service, her exceptional patient satisfaction scores, and her commitment to helping America's wounded warriors heal from their invisible wounds. She described specific cases where her approach had saved lives and prevented suicides, where her understanding of military culture had bridged gaps that other caregivers couldn't cross. The committee listened with perfunctory attention, occasionally taking notes, but clearly viewing Elena's defense as a formality rather than a meaningful opportunity to challenge their conclusions. When she finished speaking, Morrison thanked her for her service and informed her that the decision was final and not subject to appeal. Elena would be escorted from the building immediately, with her personal effects to be collected under supervision to ensure compliance with confidentiality requirements. The walk through the hospital corridors was a gauntlet of sympathetic glances and carefully neutral expressions. Word of Elena's termination had spread quickly through the informal networks that connected staff members, and her colleagues struggled to maintain professional composure while witnessing the departure of someone they respected and admired. Nurses who had sought Elena's advice about difficult patients now avoided eye contact, understanding that association with a terminated employee could jeopardize their own positions. Elena's patient assignments had been quietly redistributed without explanation, leaving veterans who had come to rely on her care wondering why their most trusted nurse had suddenly disappeared. Former Marine Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been asking for Elena all morning, becoming increasingly agitated when told that she was unavailable. His new nurse, well-meaning but lacking Elena's understanding of military culture, had been unable to establish the rapport that had been crucial to his ongoing recovery. The personal effects that Elena collected from her locker represented 3 years of dedication to veteran care. Photographs of patients who had successfully completed treatment, thank you cards from grateful families, and small mementos from veterans who had wanted to express their appreciation for her help. Each item told a story of healing and hope, of connections forged through shared understanding and mutual respect. Now these treasures would be carried away in a cardboard box, silent witnesses to a career destroyed by politics and administrative convenience. Dr. Jennifer Walsh watched Elena's departure from the psychiatric unit with a mixture of guilt and anger. She had been pressured to provide testimony that had contributed to Elena's termination, and she understood that her own career concerns had prevented her from defending someone who had been an invaluable colleague. The veterans under her care would suffer without Elena's unique ability to connect with their experiences and guide them toward healing. The security escort that accompanied Elena to the parking garage was a final humiliation, treating her like a potential threat rather than a dedicated healthcare professional who had devoted her career to helping others. The guard, a young man who had never served in the military, seemed uncomfortable with his role, but followed protocol with mechanical precision. Elena maintained her dignity throughout the process, refusing to allow this final indignity to break. Her composure as Elena loaded her personal effects into her car. She could see the hospital windows where her former patients were receiving care from nurses who might be competent, but lacked the specialized understanding that traumatized veterans required. She thought about Rodriguez, who would struggle to trust another caregiver after building a therapeutic relationship that had taken months to establish. She worried about Colonel Mitchell, whose suicidal ideation would be treated with standardized protocols rather than the personalized approach that had saved his life. The drive home was a blur of traffic and tears, as Elena finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had been taken from her. She had devoted her adult life to serving others, first as a combat medic in Afghanistan and then as a nurse, caring for veterans. Now she was unemployed, her reputation destroyed, her career apparently over. The system that was supposed to protect both patients and caregivers had instead chosen to eliminate those who challenged its priorities and methods. Elena's apartment felt empty and purposeless without the daily mission that had given her life meaning. She had built her entire identity around helping traumatized veterans heal from their invisible wounds, and now she faced an uncertain future without the work that had defined her sense of purpose. The silence was overwhelming after years of hospital sounds, patient conversations, and the constant activity of healthcare delivery. The news of Elena's termination spread through the veteran community faster than hospital administrators had anticipated. Veterans who had been under her care began asking questions about her sudden disappearance, and their families started making inquiries about the circumstances of her departure. The hospital's standard response about personnel matters and confidentiality requirements satisfied no one and only increased suspicions about the real reasons for Elena's termination. Elena's apartment became a refuge where she could process the magnitude of what had happened to her. She reviewed the termination documents repeatedly, trying to understand how her dedication to patient care had been twisted into evidence of professional misconduct. Every charge seemed to punish her for the very qualities that had made her effective: her willingness to spend extra time with struggling patients, her ability to connect through shared military experience, her refusal to treat veterans like standardized medical cases. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of Elena's termination. She had lost not only her job, but also her daily connection to the veteran community that had become her extended family. The patients who had relied on her understanding and support were now receiving care from nurses who might be well-intentioned, but lacked the specialized knowledge that trauma recovery required. Elena worried about their progress and wondered if they understood why she had abandoned them. The financial implications of Elena's termination were immediate and severe. She had been living paycheck to paycheck, devoting most of her income to supporting veteran organizations and helping former patients who couldn't afford necessary care. Now she faced unemployment benefits, job searching in a field where her reputation had been systematically destroyed, and the possibility that her nursing license might be challenged based on the hospital's allegations of professional misconduct. Elena's sense of betrayal extended beyond Dr. Caldwell to include the entire system that had failed to protect her. The hospital administration had chosen efficiency over compassion, metrics over healing, and political convenience over patient welfare. The very institution that claimed to serve America's veterans had sacrificed someone who had devoted her life to their care in order to protect an administrator whose approach was fundamentally incompatible with effective trauma treatment. The evening news carried no mention of Elena's termination, despite its significance for the veteran community. Her departure was treated as a routine personnel matter. rather than the elimination of someone who had been uniquely qualified to help traumatized warriors heal. The silence surrounding her firing was itself a form of injustice, denying recognition to someone who had made extraordinary sacrifices in service of others. Elena sat in her apartment as darkness fell, surrounded by the mementos of her destroyed career and facing an uncertain future. She had maintained her dignity throughout the systematic campaign against her, but now she wondered if her principles had been worth the price she had paid. The veterans who had depended on her care were still suffering, still needing the specialized understanding that she had provided, but she was no longer able to help them heal. The night stretched ahead with no morning shift to prepare for, no patients to care for, no mission to fulfill. Elena had lost more than her job. She had lost her purpose, her identity, and her connection to the community that had given her life meaning. The system that was supposed to protect those who served had instead chosen to destroy someone whose only crime had been caring too much about the people she was meant to help. The unprecedented response began not with official channels or administrative procedures, but with a simple question asked by a Vietnam veteran during his morning medication rounds. Former Army Sergeant Michael Thompson had been under Elena's care for 6 months, working through severe PTSD and depression that had plagued him for decades. When his new nurse, a competent but unfamiliar face, arrived to check his vitals, Thompson's first words were direct and demanding. "Where's Elena? Where's Nurse Vasquez?" The standardized response about personnel changes and confidentiality requirements satisfied no one, least of all Thompson, who had survived the Tet Offensive and recognized bureaucratic evasion when he heard it. Within hours, Thompson had spoken to every veteran patient on his floor, sharing his concerns about Elena's sudden disappearance and organizing an informal investigation into what had happened to the nurse who had become their most trusted advocate and ally. The veteran patients at St. Mary's had developed an informal communication network that operated independently of hospital administration, a brotherhood forged through shared experiences of combat, trauma, and recovery. Former Marine Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had credited Elena with saving his life during his darkest period of depression, became the unofficial leader of efforts to discover the truth about her termination. His military training and intelligence gathering proved invaluable as he began collecting information from multiple sources throughout the hospital. The first breakthrough came when Rodriguez convinced a sympathetic cafeteria worker to share what she had overheard during a staff meeting. The details were fragmentary but revealing. Elena had been terminated for policy violations and professional misconduct, charges that struck the veteran patients as completely inconsistent with their experiences of her care. Rodriguez realized that Elena had been systematically targeted and destroyed, and he began reaching out to other veterans who had been under her care. Word spread through the veteran community with the efficiency of a military communication network. Former patients who had been discharged months earlier began calling the hospital, demanding explanations for Elena's termination and sharing their own stories of how her care had been crucial to their recovery. The hospital switchboard was overwhelmed with calls from grateful veterans and their families, all asking the same question: what had happened to Nurse Vasquez? The digital age amplified the veterans' response in ways that hospital administrators had not anticipated. Rodriguez created a private Facebook group called Elena's Army, dedicated to sharing stories about her impact on veteran care and investigating the circumstances of her termination. Within 48 hours, the group had attracted over 300 members, including veterans from across the country who had heard about Elena's situation through military networks and veteran organizations. The stories that emerged painted a picture of a healthcare professional who had gone far beyond the requirements of her job to help traumatized veterans heal. Former Navy SEAL Lieutenant Commander James Peterson posted about how Elena had spent an entire night with him during a severe panic attack, helping him develop coping strategies that had been more effective than months of conventional therapy. Army medic Sarah Chun shared how Elena's understanding of military culture had helped her navigate the transition from active duty to civilian healthcare, providing support that no other nurse had been able to offer. The social media campaign attracted the attention of veteran advocacy organizations, who recognized Elena's termination as part of a larger pattern of healthcare institutions failing to understand and address the unique needs of military personnel. The Veterans of Foreign Wars, American Legion, and Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America began investigating the situation, reaching out to their members who had been patients at St. Mary's and documenting the systematic changes that had occurred. Under Dr. Caldwell's leadership, the breakthrough that would change everything came when Rodriguez discovered that one of Elena's former patients was retired Army General Patricia Harrison, who had been receiving treatment for service-related injuries at St. Mary's 6 months earlier. General Harrison had kept Elena's business card in her wallet, along with a handwritten note thanking her for the compassionate care that had helped her through a difficult recovery period. When Rodriguez contacted Harrison about Elena's termination, the general's response was immediate and decisive. General Harrison's investigation into Elena's case revealed the systematic nature of Dr. Caldwell's campaign and the complete disconnect between Elena's actual performance and the charges that had been used to justify her termination. Harrison had maintained extensive contacts throughout the military medical system, and her inquiries revealed that Elena was widely regarded as one of the most effective nurses in veteran care, with a reputation that extended far beyond St. Mary's Veterans Medical Center. The general's involvement transformed what had been a grassroots veteran response into a coordinated campaign with significant political and media implications. Harrison contacted Senator Robert Martinez, chairman of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, who had been looking for concrete examples of how healthcare institutions were failing to serve veteran populations. Elena's case provided exactly the kind of documentation that Martinez needed to support his proposed legislation for veteran healthcare reform. The media attention that followed General Harrison's involvement was unprecedented in its scope and intensity. Major news outlets picked up the story of the combat medic-turned-nurse who had been terminated for providing exceptional care to traumatized veterans. Elena's photograph appeared on newspaper front pages and television screens across the country, accompanied by stories about her military service and her dedication to helping fellow veterans heal from their invisible wounds. The hospital's response to the growing controversy was defensive and inadequate. Dr. Caldwell issued a statement defending the termination as necessary for maintaining professional standards and patient safety, but his explanations were immediately challenged by veterans who had direct experience with Elena's care. The contrast between official statements about policy violations and patient testimonials about life-saving interventions created a narrative that hospital administrators could not control. The coordination of the veteran response revealed the power of military networks and the bonds forged through shared service. Veterans who had never met Elena personally felt compelled to support her because they understood that her treatment represented a broader threat to all veterans seeking health care. The systematic destruction of someone who had devoted her life to helping traumatized warriors became a rallying point for the entire veteran community. The digital campaign expanded beyond social media to include veteran blogs, podcasts, and online forums where Elena's story was shared and discussed. Military personnel on active duty began following the case, recognizing that Elena's termination had implications for their own future healthcare needs. The story transcended individual hospital politics to become a symbol of the ongoing struggle to provide adequate care for America's wounded warriors. The investigation that General Harrison initiated revealed disturbing patterns in Dr. Caldwell's leadership that went beyond his campaign against Elena. Other nurses reported increased pressure to limit their interactions with patients while physicians described a hostile work environment that prioritized administrative metrics over patient outcomes. The systematic nature of the problems at St. Mary's became clear as more healthcare professionals found the courage to speak publicly about their concerns. The veteran response culminated in an unprecedented demonstration of solidarity that surprised even those who had organized it. On a cold Saturday morning in April, over 500 veterans and their family members gathered in the parking lot of St. Mary's Veterans Medical Center, many wearing their military uniforms and carrying signs demanding Elena's reinstatement. The sight of America's warriors standing together in support of someone who had served them created powerful imagery that resonated far beyond the immediate controversy. The demonstration was peaceful but powerful, with veterans sharing their personal stories about Elena's impact on their recovery and their concerns about the direction of veteran healthcare under Dr. Caldwell's leadership. Former patients spoke about how Elena's understanding of military culture had been crucial to their healing, while family members described how her compassionate care had helped their loved ones navigate the complex challenges of trauma recovery. Political implications of the veteran response became clear when Senator Martinez announced that he would be conducting congressional hearings into the treatment of healthcare professionals who specialized in veteran care. Elena's case would be featured prominently in these hearings, serving as an example of how institutional failures were undermining the care that America's wounded warriors deserved. The media coverage of the veteran demonstration and the broader campaign for Elena's reinstatement reached national television networks, where her story was presented as emblematic of larger problems in veteran healthcare. The contrast between Elena's dedication to her patients and the administrative system that had destroyed her career became a powerful narrative that resonated with audiences who might not have personal experience with military service, but understood the fundamental injustice of her situation. The coordination and persistence of the veteran response demonstrated the power of community organizing and the special bonds that connect those who have served in uniform. Elena's case had become more than a story about one nurse's termination. It had evolved into a movement demanding better treatment for all veterans and the healthcare professionals who served them with dedication and compassion. The call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the veteran demonstration. Elena was sitting in her apartment, reviewing job applications that would likely go nowhere given her tainted reputation, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was crisp, authoritative, identifying itself as Colonel Rebecca Martinez from the Department of Veterans Affairs Inspector General's office. The investigation that General Harrison had initiated had reached the highest levels of government, and Elena's case had become the centerpiece of a comprehensive review of veteran healthcare practices nationwide. Colonel Martinez explained that the Inspector General's investigation had uncovered systematic violations of veteran care standards at St. Mary's, with Elena's termination serving as the most egregious example of how administrative priorities had been placed above patient welfare. The investigation had revealed that Dr. Caldwell's efficiency-focused reforms had resulted in decreased patient satisfaction scores, increased readmission rates, and a disturbing pattern of early discharges that had put vulnerable veterans at risk. The evidence that emerged during the investigation was devastating for Dr. Caldwell and the hospital administration. Internal emails revealed that Caldwell had specifically targeted Elena because her patient satisfaction scores and clinical outcomes had made his metrics-driven approach look ineffective by comparison. The systematic campaign against Elena had not been about professional standards or patient safety, but about eliminating someone whose success had threatened an administrator's reputation and career prospects. The smoking gun came when investigators discovered that Caldwell had falsified documentation about Elena's performance, creating complaints that had never been filed and manipulating patient interaction data to support his case for termination. The fabricated evidence had been so convincing that even the hospital's human resources department had been deceived. But forensic analysis of computer records revealed the systematic nature of the deception and the deliberate campaign to destroy Elena's career. Senator Martinez's congressional hearings provided a national platform for exposing the injustices that Elena had suffered and the broader problems in veteran healthcare. Elena's testimony before the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee was broadcast live on C-SPAN, reaching millions of viewers who heard her describe the systematic campaign against her and the impact of her termination on the veteran patients she had served. Her quiet dignity and professional demeanor during the hearing created a powerful contrast with the bureaucratic evasions of hospital administrators. The most dramatic moment of the hearings came when former Marine Staff Sergeant Rodriguez testified about Elena's impact on his recovery and the deterioration in his condition after her termination. Rodriguez, who had attempted suicide twice since Elena's departure, spoke directly to the committee about how her understanding of military culture and combat trauma had been crucial to his healing process. His testimony was broadcast on veteran social media networks, where it generated thousands of supportive comments and shares. General Harrison's testimony provided the military perspective that gave Elena's case broader significance. The general explained how Elena's approach to veteran care represented best practices that should be adopted throughout the healthcare system, not eliminated for administrative convenience. Harrison's distinguished service record and unquestioned credibility made her support for Elena impossible to dismiss, and her criticism of Dr. Caldwell's leadership carried weight that resonated throughout the military community. The investigation's findings triggered a cascade of consequences that extended far beyond Elena's individual case. The Department of Veterans Affairs announced that it would be conducting comprehensive reviews of all medical centers serving veteran populations, with particular attention to how administrative changes had affected patient care quality. Elena's termination had become a catalyst for systemic reform that would impact veteran healthcare nationwide. Dr. Caldwell's response to the investigation was characteristic of his approach throughout the Elena controversy: defensive, evasive, and ultimately self-defeating. His testimony before the Congressional Committee revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of veteran care needs and his callous disregard for the human impact of his administrative decisions. When pressed about Elena's exceptional patient satisfaction scores, Caldwell dismissed them as irrelevant to professional standards, a response that generated audible gasps from the committee audience. The hospital board's decision to terminate Dr. Caldwell was announced during the congressional hearings, creating a dramatic moment that was captured by news cameras and broadcast nationwide. Patricia Morrison, the human resources officer who had delivered Elena's termination notice, submitted her resignation the same day, acknowledging that she had been complicit in a systematic campaign of retaliation and harassment. Elena's reinstatement came with conditions that reflected the extent of the injustice she had suffered. The hospital offered her a promotion to nurse manager position, full back pay for the period of her termination, and a formal apology that would be published in medical journals and veteran publications. More importantly, Elena was given the authority to implement the kind of veteran-focused care protocols that her experience had proven to be effective. The media coverage of Elena's vindication was extensive and overwhelmingly positive. News outlets that had initially ignored her termination now featured her story prominently, with headlines focusing on her triumph over bureaucratic injustice and her return to helping traumatized veterans. The narrative of a combat medic who had been persecuted for providing exceptional care and then vindicated through the collective action of the veteran community resonated with audiences across the political spectrum. The personal phone call that Elena received from the Secretary of Veterans Affairs represented the highest level of recognition for her dedication to veteran care. The Secretary explained that Elena's case had highlighted systemic problems in veteran healthcare that required immediate attention, and he invited her to serve on a national committee that would develop new standards for veteran care throughout the healthcare system. Elena's first day back at St. Mary's was marked by an emotional reunion with patients who had been waiting months for her return. Former Marine Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been transferred to another facility after his suicide attempts, was brought back to St. Mary's specifically to resume his care under Elena's supervision. The reunion was captured by local news cameras, providing powerful imagery of the bonds between veterans and the healthcare professionals who understood their unique needs. The implementation of Elena's new protocols represented a fundamental shift in how St. Mary's approached veteran care. Elena was given the resources and authority to train other nurses in trauma-informed care, to develop specialized programs for different types of combat-related injuries, and to create an environment where veteran patients felt understood and supported rather than processed through standardized procedures. The ripple effects of Elena's vindication extended throughout the veteran healthcare system. Other nurses who had been facing similar pressures from administrators found new courage to advocate for their patients, knowing that Elena's case had established important precedents for protecting healthcare professionals who prioritized patient welfare over administrative convenience. The Elena Vasquez case became a teaching tool in nursing schools and medical programs across the country. Congressional legislation that emerged from the hearings was named the Veterans Healthcare Protection Act, with Elena's case serving as the primary example of why such protections were necessary. The law established new safeguards for healthcare professionals who specialized in veteran care, created whistleblower protections for those who reported inadequate treatment, and mandated training in military culture and combat trauma for all healthcare workers serving veteran populations. Elena's promotion to nurse manager allowed her to implement systemic changes that would benefit veteran patients for years to come. She established peer support programs that connected veteran patients with other veterans who had successfully navigated similar challenges, created specialized treatment protocols for different types of combat trauma, and developed training programs that helped civilian healthcare workers understand the unique needs of military personnel. The transformation of St. Mary's Veterans Medical Center under Elena's leadership became a model for other healthcare institutions serving veteran populations. Patient satisfaction scores increased dramatically, readmission rates dropped significantly, and the hospital developed a reputation as a center of excellence for veteran care. Elena's approach, which had been characterized as unprofessional and inefficient, was now recognized as the gold standard for trauma-informed healthcare. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The veteran community's response to Elena's vindication was immediate and overwhelming. The Elena's Army Facebook group, which had grown to over 5,000 members during the campaign for her reinstatement, became a forum for sharing success stories and supporting other veterans who were facing healthcare challenges. Elena's case had demonstrated the power of collective action and the importance of advocating for those who had served their country. The long-term impact of Elena's vindication extended beyond individual career restoration to encompass fundamental changes in how the healthcare system approached veteran care. Her case had exposed the dangers of prioritizing administrative efficiency over patient welfare and had established important precedents for protecting healthcare professionals who advocated for their patients' needs. Elena's story had become more than a tale of personal triumph. It had evolved into a catalyst for systemic reform that would benefit countless veterans and the healthcare professionals who served them. The quiet nurse who had been terminated for providing exceptional care had become a symbol of the ongoing struggle to ensure that America's wounded warriors received the care and respect they deserved. 2 years after her vindication, Elena Vasquez stood in the auditorium of the National Veterans Healthcare Summit, preparing to address an audience of over 1,200 healthcare professionals, military leaders, and policymakers. The woman who had once been terminated for providing exceptional care to traumatized veterans was now the keynote speaker at the most prestigious gathering of veteran healthcare specialists in the country. Her journey from disgrace to national recognition had transformed not only her own life but the entire landscape of veteran medical care. The changes at St. Mary's Veterans Medical Center were immediately visible to anyone who walked through its corridors. The sterile, efficiency-focused environment that Dr. Caldwell had created had been replaced by a welcoming space that acknowledged the military experience of its patients. Elena's leadership had brought art therapy programs, peer support groups, and specialized treatment protocols that addressed the unique needs of combat trauma survivors. The hospital had become a model for other institutions seeking to improve their veteran care programs. Elena's promotion to Director of Veteran Care Services had given her the authority to implement comprehensive reforms that extended beyond individual patient interactions to encompass the entire institutional culture. She had established mandatory training programs for all staff members, ensuring that everyone from physicians to janitors understood the basics of military culture and combat trauma. The result was a healthcare environment where veterans felt understood and respected rather than processed through standardized procedures. The patient satisfaction scores at St. Mary's had reached record levels under Elena's leadership, with veteran patients consistently rating their care as exceptional. More importantly, clinical outcomes had improved dramatically, with reduced readmission rates, decreased suicide attempts, and higher rates of successful treatment completion. The metrics that Dr. Caldwell had prioritized had actually improved. When patient welfare was placed at the center of healthcare delivery, Elena's influence had extended far beyond St. Mary's through her role as a consultant to the Department of Veterans Affairs. She had helped develop new national standards for veteran healthcare that emphasized trauma-informed care, cultural competency, and the importance of healthcare providers with military experience. Her protocols were being implemented at veteran medical centers across the country, transforming how thousands of healthcare professionals approached their work with military patients. The Elena Vasquez Fellowship Program, established by a coalition of veteran organizations, provided scholarships for military veterans pursuing careers in healthcare. The program recognized that Elena's success had been partly due to her ability to understand veteran experiences from the inside, and it aimed to create a new generation of healthcare professionals who could bridge the gap between military and civilian medical cultures. The first cohort of fellows was already making significant contributions to veteran care at hospitals throughout the nation. Elena's personal life had been enriched by her professional vindication and the meaningful relationships she had built with colleagues who shared her commitment to veteran welfare. She had married Dr. Michael Torres, a psychiatrist who specialized in combat trauma, and had been inspired by Elena's approach to join the staff at St. Mary's. Their partnership represented both personal happiness and professional collaboration, as they worked together to develop innovative treatment protocols that addressed the complex needs of traumatized veterans. The congressional testimony that had vindicated Elena had led to her regular involvement in policy discussions at the highest levels of government. She served on advisory committees for the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Defense, and the National Institute of Mental Health, providing expertise on veteran healthcare issues and advocating for policies that prioritized patient welfare over administrative convenience. Her voice had become influential in shaping national approaches to veteran care. Elena's impact on individual veterans continued to be the source of her greatest satisfaction. Former Marine Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had credited Elena with saving his life, had completed his recovery and was now working as a peer counselor at St. Mary's, helping other veterans navigate their own healing journeys. His transformation from a suicidal patient to a healer, himself demonstrated the long-term effects of Elena's approach to veteran care. The ripple effects of Elena's vindication had extended throughout the healthcare profession, inspiring other nurses and physicians to advocate more strongly for their patients' needs. The Elena Vasquez case had become a teaching tool in nursing schools and medical programs, demonstrating the importance of courage and integrity in healthcare delivery. Students learned that sometimes the most professional response to institutional pressure was to prioritize patient welfare over administrative demands. Elena's book, Healing Warriors: A Nurse's Journey from Combat to Compassion, had become bestseller and required reading in veteran healthcare programs across the country. The book detailed her military service, her approach to veteran care, and the systematic campaign that had nearly destroyed her career. More importantly, it provided practical guidance for healthcare professionals, working with traumatized veterans and families seeking to understand their loved ones' experiences. The documentary film about Elena's story, The Nurse Who Wouldn't Give Up, had been nominated for an Academy Award and had brought national attention to the challenges facing veteran healthcare. The film had been screened at military bases worldwide, in VA medical centers, and at nursing schools, reaching audiences who might not have otherwise understood the complexities of veteran care. Elena's story had become a symbol of integrity and perseverance in the face of institutional injustice. Elena's influence on veteran healthcare policy had been formalized through her appointment to the National Advisory Committee on Veteran Healthcare Quality. The committee, established in response to the reforms triggered by her case, was responsible for developing standards and practices that would ensure high-quality care for all veterans. Elena's military experience and clinical expertise made her uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between policymakers and healthcare providers. The transformation of veteran healthcare that Elena had helped initiate was being measured in lives saved and futures restored. Suicide rates among veterans receiving care at institutions that had implemented Elena's protocols had decreased significantly, while treatment completion rates had improved dramatically. The approach that had been dismissed as unprofessional and inefficient was now recognized as evidence-based best practice for veteran care. Elena's leadership had inspired a new generation of healthcare professionals who understood that excellence in veteran care required more than clinical competence. The nurses, physicians, and support staff who had trained under Elena's guidance were now spreading throughout the healthcare system, carrying with them the principles and practices that had made St. Mary's a model for veteran care. Elena's influence was multiplying as her protégés took leadership roles at other institutions. The annual Elena Vasquez Award for Excellence in Veteran Care had been established by the American Nurses Association to recognize healthcare professionals who demonstrated exceptional dedication to serving military populations. The award criteria emphasized not just clinical competence, but also courage in advocating for patient needs, cultural competency in working with military personnel, and innovation in developing new approaches to veteran care. Elena herself served on the selection committee, ensuring that the award recognized the qualities that had defined her own career. Elena's speaking engagements had taken her to military bases, medical schools, and healthcare conferences across the country and internationally. Her message was consistent. Veteran care required understanding, respect, and the courage to challenge systems that prioritized efficiency over healing. Her presentations were always well received, but Elena found the greatest satisfaction in the individual conversations with young healthcare professionals who were inspired to dedicate their careers to serving veterans. The research that Elena had initiated during her time at St. Mary's had contributed to the growing body of evidence supporting trauma-informed care approaches. Her collaboration with academic researchers had produced peer-reviewed studies that documented the effectiveness of military culturally competent healthcare delivery. These studies were being used to support policy changes and funding decisions that would benefit veteran healthcare nationwide. Elena's impact extended to the families of veterans, who had been largely ignored by traditional healthcare approaches. She had developed family support programs that helped spouses and children understand and cope with their loved ones' combat trauma. These programs had been adopted by other institutions and had become standard components of comprehensive veteran care. Elena understood that healing often required involving entire families in the recovery process. The mentorship program that Elena had established at St. Mary's paired experienced veteran healthcare providers with newcomers to the field. The program ensured that Elena's knowledge and approach would be passed on to future generations of caregivers, creating a sustainable system for maintaining high-quality veteran care. Elena's commitment to teaching and mentoring had become as important as her direct patient care activities. Elena's story had become a source of hope and inspiration for healthcare professionals facing their own challenges with institutional pressures and administrative demands. Her example demonstrated that integrity and patient advocacy could ultimately prevail over bureaucratic convenience, even when the personal costs were severe. Healthcare professionals across the country drew strength from Elena's story when they faced difficult decisions about patient care versus administrative compliance. The legacy of Elena's vindication extended beyond healthcare to encompass broader questions about institutional accountability and the treatment of whistleblowers. Her case had established important precedents for protecting employees who advocated for vulnerable populations, and it had demonstrated the power of community organizing and advocacy in challenging institutional injustice. Elena's story had become a case study in business schools and public administration programs. As Elena looked out at the audience of healthcare professionals gathered for the National Veterans Healthcare Summit, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The nurse who had been terminated for providing exceptional care had become a national leader in veteran healthcare reform. Her quiet dignity during the darkest moments of her career had inspired a movement that was transforming how America cared for its wounded warriors. The standing ovation that greeted Elena as she approached the podium was more than recognition of her personal triumph. It was acknowledgement of the principles she represented and the changes she had helped bring about. Elena's story had demonstrated that excellence in healthcare required more than clinical competence. It demanded courage, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to patient welfare. Her legacy would continue to inspire healthcare professionals for generations to come, ensuring that America's veterans received the care and respect they deserved. 5 years after her vindication, Elena Vasquez walked through the gleaming corridors of the newly constructed Elena Vasquez Veterans Rehabilitation Center, a state-of-the-art facility that had been built using principles she had developed during her transformation of St. Mary's Veterans Medical Center. The center, funded through a combination of government appropriations and private donations from veteran organizations, represented the ultimate validation of her approach to veteran care and served as a living monument to the power of integrity and perseverance in the face of institutional injustice. The Rehabilitation Center was unlike any veteran healthcare facility that had existed before. Elena's vision had created a space that acknowledged the military experience from the moment veterans entered the building. The lobby featured displays honoring different branches of service, while the treatment areas were designed to feel welcoming rather than clinical. Every detail, from the color schemes to the furniture arrangement, had been carefully considered to create an environment that would help traumatized veterans feel safe and understood. Elena's role as executive director of the center allowed her to implement comprehensive care protocols that addressed not just physical injuries, but the full spectrum of challenges facing modern veterans. The facility included specialized units for traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse recovery, and vocational rehabilitation. More importantly, it provided integrated care that recognized the connections between these different aspects of veteran health and recovery. Innovation that set Elena's center apart was its emphasis on peer support and veteran-to-veteran mentorship. Former patients who had successfully completed their recovery programs were trained as peer counselors, creating a network of support that extended far beyond the clinical staff. Elena had learned during her own military service that the most powerful healing often came from connections with others who had shared similar experiences. The center's treatment philosophy was built around Elena's understanding that effective veteran care required more than medical expertise. It demanded recognition of the warrior culture and the unique challenges facing those who had served in combat. The staff included a high percentage of veterans who could relate to their patients' experiences, while civilian caregivers received extensive training in military culture and combat trauma. Elena had created an environment where veterans felt understood rather than judged. Elena's influence on national veteran healthcare policy had continued to grow, with her appointment to the Presidential Commission on Veteran Healthcare Reform. The commission was tasked with developing comprehensive recommendations for improving veteran care throughout the United States, and Elena's experience and expertise made her one of the most influential voices in the process. Her recommendations were being implemented at veteran medical centers nationwide. The research component of Elena's center had become a leading source of evidence-based practices in veteran care. Elena had established partnerships with major universities and research institutions, creating studies that documented the effectiveness of her approaches and contributed to the growing body of knowledge about trauma-informed care. The research was being used to support policy changes and funding decisions that would benefit veterans throughout the healthcare system. Elena's personal story had evolved beyond her professional vindication to encompass her role as a mother and community leader. She and her husband Michael had adopted 2 children whose veteran father had died by suicide, providing them with the stability and understanding that only fellow veterans could offer. Elena's family life reflected her commitment to the veteran community and her silly understanding that healing often required addressing the needs of entire families. The Elena Vasquez Foundation, established with proceeds from her book and speaking engagements, provided scholarships and support for veterans pursuing careers in healthcare and other helping professions. The foundation recognized that Elena's success had been partly due to her ability to understand veteran experiences from the inside, and it aimed to create opportunities for other veterans to use their experiences to help their fellow service members. Elena's impact on individual veterans continued to be measured in lives saved and futures restored. The center's patient success rates were among the highest in the country, with significantly lower rates of suicide, substance abuse relapse, and treatment dropout. More importantly, veterans who completed programs at Elena's center were successfully transitioning to civilian careers, maintaining stable relationships, and contributing positively to their communities. The documentary series that had been produced about Elena's center and its patients had brought national attention to the ongoing challenges facing veteran healthcare. The series, which followed individual veterans through their recovery journeys, demonstrated the human impact of Elena's approach and the importance of comprehensive, culturally competent care. The series had been broadcast internationally, inspiring similar programs in other countries. Elena's influence on healthcare education had been formalized through her appointment as a visiting professor at several major universities. She taught courses on veteran healthcare, trauma-informed care, and healthcare leadership, sharing her knowledge with the next generation of healthcare professionals. Her students were being placed in positions throughout the healthcare system, carrying Elena's principles and practices to institutions across the country. The annual Elena Vasquez Veterans Healthcare Conference had become the premier gathering for professionals working with military populations. The conference brought together researchers, clinicians, policymakers, and veterans themselves to share best practices and develop new approaches to veteran care. Elena's opening address each year set the tone for discussions that influenced veteran healthcare policy and practice nationwide. Elena's advocacy had extended beyond healthcare to encompass broader issues affecting veteran welfare. She had testified before Congress about veteran homelessness, unemployment, and suicide prevention, using her platform to draw attention to systemic problems that required comprehensive solutions. Her voice had become influential in shaping national approaches to veteran support services. The transformation of veteran healthcare that Elena had helped initiate was being measured in improved outcomes across multiple indicators. Veterans receiving care at institutions that had implemented Elena's protocols showed better treatment compliance, higher satisfaction scores, and improved long-term outcomes. The approach that had been dismissed as unprofessional was now recognized as the gold standard for veteran care. Elena's leadership had inspired a movement that extended far beyond healthcare to encompass broader questions about institutional accountability and the treatment of vulnerable populations. Her story had become a case study in business schools, public administration programs, and leadership development courses. Students learned that effective leadership required courage, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to serving others. The ripple effects of Elena's vindication had created a network of healthcare professionals who understood that excellence in veteran care required more than clinical competence. The nurses, physicians, and support staff who had trained under Elena's guidance were now in leadership roles at institutions throughout the country, spreading her principles and practices across the healthcare system. Elena's influence on veteran healthcare research had contributed to groundbreaking studies that were changing how the medical community understood and treated combat trauma. Her collaboration with neuroscientists had produced research on the brain changes caused by combat exposure, while her work with psychologists had developed new therapeutic approaches for treating post-traumatic stress disorder. The research was being used to develop new treatments and support services for veterans. The mentorship program that Elena had established had created a pipeline of skilled healthcare professionals dedicated to serving veteran populations. The program paired experienced providers with newcomers, ensuring that Elena's knowledge and approach would be passed on to future generations. The mentorship relationships often lasted for years, creating a network of professionals who supported each other in their commitment to veteran care. Elena's speaking engagements had taken her to audiences around the world, sharing her story and expertise with international healthcare communities. Her message about the importance of culturally competent care and institutional integrity resonated with healthcare professionals facing similar challenges in their own countries. Elena's influence was contributing to improvements in veteran care globally. The awards and recognition that Elena had received were numerous and prestigious, but she remained focused on the work itself rather than the accolades. She had received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, in recognition of her contributions to veteran welfare. The award ceremony had been attended by veterans from across the country who had been touched by Elena's work. Elena's impact on healthcare policy had been institutionalized through legislation that required veteran medical centers to meet specific standards for culturally competent care. The Elena Vasquez Veterans Healthcare Standards Act established minimum requirements for staff training, patient support services, and quality monitoring. The legislation ensured that Elena's principles would be embedded in veteran healthcare for generations to come. The transformation that Elena had brought to veteran healthcare was being replicated internationally, with healthcare systems in other countries adopting her approaches and protocols. Elena had consulted with governments and healthcare organizations worldwide, sharing her expertise and helping them develop their own veteran care programs. Her influence was contributing to better care for military personnel and veterans globally. Elena's story had become more than a tale of personal triumph. It had evolved into a symbol of the ongoing struggle to ensure that those who served their country received the care and respect they deserved. Her quiet dignity during the darkest moments of her career had inspired a movement that was transforming how society approached veteran welfare. The nurse who had been terminated for providing exceptional care had become a national treasure, whose legacy would endure for generations. The future that Elena was building through her work at the Rehabilitation Center and her broader influence on veteran healthcare represented hope for the thousands of veterans who would need care in the years to come. Her story demonstrated that individual courage and integrity could create systemic change, and that the fight for justice and compassion in healthcare was worth whatever personal sacrifices it might require. 10 years after her vindication, Elena Vasquez stood before the United Nations General Assembly, delivering a keynote address on global veteran healthcare standards to representatives from 193 countries. The nurse who had once been terminated for providing exceptional care had become the world's leading authority on veteran rehabilitation, her influence extending far beyond American borders to shape international approaches to military healthcare. Her speech, broadcast to millions worldwide, represented the culmination of a journey that had transformed not only her own life, but the lives of countless veterans across the globe. The moment that would define Elena's legacy came during her UN address when she shared the podium with General Patricia Harrison, now retired, but still her closest ally in the fight for veteran rights. The two women, representing different generations of military service, stood together as symbols of the transformation that had occurred in veteran care over the past decade. Their partnership had evolved from professional collaboration to deep friendship, built on shared commitment to serving those who had served their country. The most profound moment of Elena's address came when she was introduced to the Assembly by Secretary General Maria Santos, herself a former combat medic who had been inspired by Elena's story to pursue a career in international humanitarian work. Santos described Elena as the woman who taught the world that healing requires more than medicine. It requires understanding, respect, and the courage to challenge systems that fail those who need them most. Elena's influence had transcended national boundaries through the Global Veterans Healthcare Initiative, an international organization she had founded to share best practices and coordinate research on veteran care worldwide. The initiative had established partnerships with healthcare systems in over 50 countries, creating a network of professionals dedicated to improving care for military personnel and veterans. Elena's protocols were being adapted and implemented in healthcare systems from Australia to Zimbabwe. The revolutionary approach that Elena had developed at her rehabilitation center had become the foundation for a new generation of veteran care facilities worldwide. The Elena Vasquez treatment model, as it had become known in academic circles, emphasized culturally competent care, peer support, and integrated treatment approaches that addressed the full spectrum of veteran needs. Medical schools and nursing programs around the world now taught courses based on Elena's principles and practices. Elena's personal story had evolved beyond her professional achievements to encompass her role as a global advocate for vulnerable populations. She had used her platform to draw attention to the needs of refugees, trafficking survivors, and other groups who had experienced trauma similar to that faced by combat veterans. Her understanding of healing had expanded to encompass universal principles of human dignity and resilience. The research that Elena had initiated during her early years at St. Mary's had grown into a comprehensive body of knowledge that was transforming how the medical community understood and treated trauma. Her collaboration with neuroscientists had produced groundbreaking studies on the brain changes caused by combat exposure, while her work with psychologists had developed new therapeutic approaches that were being used to treat trauma survivors. Worldwide, Elena's influence on healthcare education had been formalized through the Elena Vasquez Institute for Veteran Healthcare, a postgraduate program that trained healthcare professionals in the specialized skills needed to serve military populations. The institute, affiliated with multiple universities, had graduated over 5,000 healthcare professionals who were now working in veteran care facilities worldwide. Elena's teaching had created a global network of professionals who shared her commitment to excellence in veteran care. The documentary film that had been produced about Elena's global impact, Healing the Warriors, A Decade of Transformation, had been nominated for multiple international awards and had brought her story to audiences worldwide. The film followed Elena's work in different countries, showing how her approaches were being adapted to serve veterans from diverse cultural backgrounds. The documentary had been translated into 23 languages and was being used as a training tool in healthcare programs globally. Elena's impact on individual veterans continued to be the source of her greatest satisfaction, even as her influence had expanded to encompass global policy and practice. The rehabilitation center that bore her name had treated over 15,000 veterans, with success rates that remained among the highest in the world. More importantly, many of these veterans had gone on to become peer counselors, healthcare professionals, and advocates themselves, multiplying Elena's impact exponentially. The Elena Vasquez Foundation had evolved into a global organization that provided scholarships, research funding, and support for veteran healthcare initiatives worldwide. The foundation's work extended beyond direct service provision to include advocacy for policy changes that would benefit veterans in different countries. Elena's vision had created a sustainable mechanism for continuing her work long after her retirement. Elena's influence on international humanitarian law had been recognized through her appointment to the International Committee of the Red Cross, where she served as an advisor on the treatment of former combatants and the provision of healthcare in conflict zones. Her expertise had been sought by governments and international organizations seeking to develop policies that would protect the rights of military personnel and veterans. That the transformation of veteran healthcare that Elena had helped initiate was being measured in improved outcomes across multiple countries and healthcare systems. Veterans receiving care at institutions that had implemented Elena's protocols showed better treatment compliance, higher satisfaction scores, and improved long-term outcomes regardless of their cultural background or the specific nature of their military service. Her approaches had proven to be universally applicable to veteran populations. Elena's leadership had inspired a global movement that extended far beyond healthcare to encompass broader questions about how society should treat those who had served in military roles. Her story had become a symbol of the ongoing struggle to ensure that veterans received the care and respect they deserved, regardless of their nationality or the conflicts in which they had served. The awards and recognition that Elena had received were numerous and came from organizations worldwide, but she remained focused on the work itself rather than the accolades. She had received honorary doctorates from universities on 6 continents, had been inducted into the International Humanitarian Hall of Fame, and had been recognized by the World Health Organization for her contributions to global health. Each award represented not just personal achievement, but validation of her approaches to veteran care. Elena's speaking engagements had taken her to every continent, sharing her story and expertise with audiences that included government officials, healthcare professionals, and veteran organizations. Her message about the importance of culturally competent care and institutional integrity resonated with people facing similar challenges in their own countries. Elena's influence was contributing to improvements in veteran care globally, with her principles being adapted to serve diverse populations. The ripple effects of Elena's vindication had created a worldwide network of healthcare professionals who understood that excellence in veteran care required more than clinical competence. The nurses, physicians, and support staff who had trained under Elena's guidance were now in leadership roles at institutions throughout the world, spreading her principles and practices across multiple healthcare systems and cultural contexts. Elena's influence on veteran healthcare research had contributed to groundbreaking studies that were changing how the global medical community understood and treated combat trauma. Her collaboration with researchers from different countries had produced cross-cultural studies that demonstrated the universal nature of combat trauma while also highlighting the importance of culturally specific approaches to treatment. The mentorship program that Elena had established had created a global pipeline of skilled healthcare professionals dedicated to serving veteran populations. The program now operated in 15 countries, pairing experienced providers with newcomers and ensuring that Elena's knowledge and approach would be passed on to future generations, regardless of their geographic location or cultural background. Elena's impact on healthcare policy had been institutionalized through international agreements that established minimum standards for veteran care worldwide. The Global Veterans Healthcare Accords, negotiated with Elena's direct involvement, required signatory countries to meet specific standards for culturally competent care, staff training, and quality monitoring. The accords ensured that Elena's principles would be embedded in veteran healthcare systems globally. The transformation that Elena had brought to veteran healthcare was being replicated and adapted in countries with diverse healthcare systems and cultural contexts. Her consultation work had taken her to nations recovering from conflict, to developed countries seeking to improve their veteran services, and to international organizations working to establish veteran care standards in post-conflict regions. Elena's story had become more than a tale of personal triumph. It had evolved into a global symbol of the ongoing struggle to ensure that those who served their countries received the care and respect they deserved. Her quiet dignity during the darkest moments of her career had inspired a worldwide movement that was transforming how societies approached veteran welfare. The future that Elena was building through her global work represented hope for the millions of veterans worldwide who would need care in the years to come. Her story demonstrated that individual courage and integrity could create systemic change that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. The nurse who had been terminated for providing exceptional care had become a global leader, whose legacy would endure for generations. Elena's influence extended beyond healthcare to encompass broader questions about how society should treat vulnerable populations and how individuals could create positive change in the face of institutional resistance. Her story had become a case study in leadership programs worldwide, teaching students that effective leadership required courage, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to serving others. The legacy that Elena was creating through her work would continue long after her retirement, embedded in the healthcare systems, educational programs, and policy frameworks that she had helped establish. Her impact on veteran care would be measured not just in the lives she had directly touched, but in the millions of veterans who would receive better care because of the systems and standards she had created. 15 years after her vindication, Elena Vasquez received a phone call that would create the most profound moment of her remarkable journey. The voice on the other end belonged to retired Army General William Hayes, who was calling from Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, with news that would forever change Elena's understanding of her own service and sacrifice. General Hayes explained that he had been conducting research into casualties from Operation Enduring Freedom when he discovered something extraordinary about Elena's own combat service that had never been fully documented. The revelation came through newly declassified military records that General Hayes had been reviewing as part of a comprehensive study of Medal of Honor recipients and their subsequent contributions to veteran welfare. During his research, Hayes had uncovered evidence that Elena's actions during the Taliban ambush outside Kandahar had been far more significant than anyone had previously understood. The convoy attack that had left her with shrapnel wounds had actually been a coordinated assault on a medical unit that was evacuating critically wounded soldiers from a forward operating base. Elena's actions during that ambush, Hayes explained, had saved the lives of 17 wounded soldiers who were being transported to field hospitals. When the convoy came under attack, Elena had continued to provide medical care to the wounded while under heavy fire, using her own body to shield critically injured soldiers from further harm. Her decision to remain with the wounded rather than seek cover had allowed the convoy to complete its mission and deliver life-saving medical care to soldiers who would have died without her intervention.